Well, thank you all for joining us for this month's Night Matters membership meeting. So great to see so many familiar faces, some new names as well. We love to see that our movement is growing, that our membership is growing, because your contributions, your support make all the difference for us in the work we do. And we want to, in turn, support you guys. And part of that is bringing you great content each month, like our speaker today, who I will introduce here shortly. But couple quick things. We do have captions and translations, and they should be at the bottom of your screen of Zoom. If you're having trouble, please message in the chat. That way we let Celeste do her presentation without any audio interruptions. We will be taking questions and answers at the end. So we'll have a few minutes left over to take your questions, but please feel free to ask your questions in the chat as well. My colleague, Drew Reagan, who is our communications manager, will also be helping co-host the meeting. And so both of us will be kind of fielding your questions that we'll direct to Celeste at the end of her presentation. So all that to say, one more housekeeping item. International Dark Sky Week is coming up in less than a month and a half now. April 2nd through the 8th is when we will be celebrating our annual kickoff of exciting events, outreach for our movement. And for those of us, of course, in North America, we also are celebrating a total solar eclipse. So what a way to get more people involved. Captive audiences looking up. So definitely use that to our advantage. With that, I ask everybody to please mute your microphones. And if you can, turn off your cameras. That way we can save on bandwidth. But without further ado, I'm going to introduce our esteemed speaker today, Celeste Henery. She is a cultural anthropologist working at the intersections of race, gender, and well-being. Her research interests broadly include Black ecologies, feminisms, and Diaspora studies, and more recently, light pollution and justice. She currently works as a research associate in the Department of African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and with the Contextualization and Commemoration initiative at UT. Her writing on issues relating to Black life across the diaspora have been published in various academic journals and blogs, including Black Perspectives. She presented her work on matters of light justice at the McDonald Observatory and for the Illuminating Engineering Society. In addition to her academic endeavors, Dr. Henery has served as an expert witness for death sentenced persons and conducted oral histories for the Texas After Violence Project, where she is currently a program advisor. She also enjoys guiding others in their creative writing projects. So, Celeste, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for being here and sharing your experience and your expertise with us. And with that, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to take 1 second to get my slide presentation up with all the appropriate buttons hit. Hey, we got that going. And then let me just get. There we go. Thanks for your patience. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, and for some of you, possibly good evening. It's great to be with you here today. And I want to thank the Dark Sky International for the gracious invitation to be here and to share a little bit about the work and thinking I've been doing. And I also want to thank Allison Bressler in absence, who was my first point of contact to the organization, for her warm orientation, and as well as Susan and Michael's support in these last couple of days to get my stuff together and to be here. Last but not least, I want to thank you, the audience, for your time and interest in this work. We all share an appreciation and robust care for the night skies. And I hope it's in that spirit that I want to contribute to this conversation and environmental endeavor. So let me first begin by introducing you to how I came to this work. As Michael shared, I'm an anthropologist, and my training and research has focused on questions of wellness in Black communities across the diaspora, specifically in Brazil and here in the United States. My work has concentrated on mental health and carceral issues, which include, but more recently, I've been working on in this field of kind of Black ecological thinking, which includes environmental justice. This exploration is inspired more or less from my own love of the outdoors, which wasn't the focus of my academic research. And this interest took me to reading Paul Bogart's The End of Night several years ago, which many of you or some of you may have read. This book brought back memories of my childhood, sitting on my grandmother's porch in Northern California, as well as memories of starry skies in Arizona, where my grandfather lived. Bogart's End of Night also introduced me to the Bortle scale that I learned was created in 2001 by amateur American astronomer John Bortle. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this scale. Bortle's design of a scale to evaluate the observability of celestial objects provided a straightforward shorthand for both the clarity of a dark night, something that I had witnessed, I think, in Arizona, and on the other side of this spectrum, light pollution that I've also witnessed in big cities for the most part. What drew my attention was not the range and visibility, but the nomenclature. Bortle's class 1 was an excellent dark sky, where the entire sky, as Bortle writes, the entire sky is brightly lit, even at the zenith. On one side of this spectrum, there were adjectives, excellent and dark. And on the other side, we have this designation of the inner city sky. And this is a language that evokes a very specific geographical area that has been saturated in racial and class histories. This language, which emerged in the 1960s and 70s, social welfare literature, has become a euphemism for poor urban spaces, frequently Black, often blighted, criminalized, and now polluted with light and other pollutants as well. It is a language that not only collapses, but avoids discussions of racial and economic oppression and marginalization. Although Bortle's use of inner city undoubtedly was concerned with only quantifying the environmental concern of light pollution, the use of the term evokes a history with little recognition or accountability to the injustices around light and of people of the so-called inner city, past and present. In the arrangement of the scale, one could conclude that the inner city and de facto its people are the problems, if not the obstacles, to a clear night sky. In light of this, today I want to speak more about the so-called inner city, its criminalization, and light pollution. I want to make the case that learning about these spatial, racial, and social histories of marginalized people are critical to addressing the problems of light pollution and working towards light justice and darker skies. I'll do this through a reading of the much discussed omnipresence, basically the policing strategy in New York that paired floodlights with policing practices as a form of crime prevention. I will address how light is weaponized against marginalized communities, and will consider light pollution within social and racist justice frames. Additionally, I will suggest the development of a concept of just darkness, a complement to light justice, as a way of having the work of conservation and the preservation of darkness grapple with historical and contemporary inequities of power, place, race, resources, and voice. Some of what I share might be a review for some of you of past speakers like Leah Osborne, who presented last year, I think in February, as well as publications from Dark Skies International. I also want to recognize that my work is deeply centered in US conversations, although my hope is that my thinking has some relevance to places and circumstances beyond this country and with non-Western ideas of environmentalism. So now to begin, I'm going to go back to omnipresence. I will screen a brief documentary on the effects of omnipresence, this crime reduction policing strategy in New York, of which a key component was the use of floodlights. Again, as Leah Osborne from Light Justice talked about in her talk, as well as Dark Sky director Ruskin Hartley and the folks at Light Justice, they've all written about basically this program and making a case for its detrimental impacts. The tactic of omnipresence emerged as part of the mayor's action plan. This is de Blasio's, and it was launched in 2014. And as I said, it paired high visibility outdoor lighting with continuous police presence as a crime reduction safety measure in housing projects across New York City and its 5 boroughs. De Blasio announced in his action plan for neighborhood safety that his administration would be investing $210 million towards reducing crime in 15 public housing projects that were responsible for about 20% of crime across the total of 334 projects. And de Blasio stated at this kind of inaugurational moment, quote, "One of the biggest things we're going to act on is safety lighting. So there are too many parts of developments that are not in the nighttime hours safe to residents, in part because they're not well lit." Continuing on, Chief Gomez, who was the chief of police at the time, he says, "We'll tell you, the officers depend on being able to see what's going on. They know a well-lit environment creates an atmosphere of safety. It makes it harder for those who are doing the wrong thing to go about that. It makes it easier for law-abiding citizens to have a better experience." Creating nighttime illumination was a central part of MAP, the action program, and included 150 temporary light towers installed that summer. In 2016, the 150 expanded to 400 units of lighting across 40 projects. These figures and de Blasio's quotes offer you some information about how omnipresence was laid out. The documentary that I'm about to show you, however, and the documentary is, I should say, is made by a Black filmmaker by the name of Nadia Hallgren. This documentary captures more of the experiences with omnipresent from the standpoint of residents, both in their reflections about the lighting as well as about living in public housing and some of the stereotypes. This I'm going to offer as an important counterpart to the city's representation of omnipresence, specifically and more broadly, sort of generalizing narratives about the quote unquote inner city.
There is a light shining directly into my bedroom. It's very bright.
If you were to be staring at the sun for a while, that's what it looks like.
It's like a big square, and then it has like a pole attached to it, and then on the pole there's like 4 headlights and they're round.
It sounds like a lot of air conditioners together in here. It sounds like that.
I live in Edenwald housing projects in the Bronx. When I first moved here and I saw the lights, I was like, okay, so this is gonna be one of those neighborhoods again. The New York Police Department put them out. And usually it's because in that area there's been like robbing or killing and things like that. I thought it was gonna be a bad neighborhood.
It's just calm. Everyone's friendly and stuff.
At first it was hard getting used to the light because it was just so bright and it was loud and I wasn't used to that. I might not be able to go to sleep because of the light. Sometimes I do wish I would have bought those black shades that block out the light.
I live here with my mom, my sister, and my little brother. My mom is a single mom right now.
After a while, I did become used to it. It's like something that I see every day. It's almost like seeing my mom every day. Like if you were to take her away, you'll be like, oh, where'd she go? So that's how I feel about that light now.
If we're laying down on the couch or something, the light will come in. It comes in through the window and it takes over the whole room.
I try my best not to go where the light is hitting.
I don't think the lights are gonna go away because these are projects. And usually people think bad things when they think about projects.
I feel like now the light's comforting. Now my body has adjusted to the light.
So omnipresence rolled out without much public information. Likewise, there wasn't tons of immediate media coverage about it. But in the reporting in the following years, residents spoke out about the lighting and their feelings about safety. Like in the documentary you just watched, they talked about the brightness of the lights and what it's like trying to sleep with floodlights outside of your window. Some expressed that the lighting made them feel safer. Others experienced the lighting and police presence as ongoing surveillance of a community rather than protection. Some had held kind of dual feelings of both wanting support for communities with reducing crime, but were ambivalent, if not had serious reservations about the intense police presence. Greg Jackson Jr., a teacher and the son of a local basketball hero in East Brooklyn, in speaking about omnipresence, affirmed the need for safety and welcomed the police, but also added, quote, "I do feel like we live under siege." A significant piece of film, I should say, that was produced by the New York Times compared this lighting tactic to the NYPD's notorious stop and frisk policing. This practice of temporarily detaining individuals and searching them for contraband has been readily criticized for its racial profiling and disproportionate targeting of Black and brown people in low-income neighborhoods and in housing projects. According to the ACLU of New York, from 2003 to 2022, and this practice was going on in the 1990s, 90% of people stopped by the NYPD were people of color. Stop and frisk also disproportionately impacted young people. Black and Latinx 15 to 24-year-olds accounted for approximately 40% of all stops. What this practice did was dramatically increase negative encounters between the police and communities, particularly young people. The result has been deep mistrust and fear of the police, general feelings of unsafety, sometimes physical and lasting psychological harm, in addition to cascading interactions with the criminal legal system, the police being the point of contact between residents and the criminal legal system and ultimately incarceration. Residents had an acute awareness of how policing had been used in aggressive ways that criminalized and incarcerated community members. They understood that their neighborhoods and residents were perceived as violent and dangerous. Omnipresence lighting and police presence felt more like the same policing approach of surveillance and criminalization of residential communities. The key difference was this time lighting became an instrument and a tactic. The use of lighting and omnipresence relied on the premise that lighting not only can serve as a tool of safety, but that it prevents crime. This understanding in the US emerges in the context of a history of illumination that dates back to the Middle Ages in Europe. So let's go back in time for a second. Beginning in the 15th century, public lighting in the form of candlelit lanterns and torches were viewed as security measures in cities like Paris and London, where residents were sometimes kept in at night by curfew and mandated to have lights on their homes. In Paris, those traveling the city by night would have to be accompanied by a light source with the express purpose of making the traveler visible. Light was deployed as a mechanism of order in this monarchy, a representation of state presence and power to surveil and to police subjects. With the creation of gas-powered lighting, city streets, the lighting of city streets became prevalent in many of the major cities worldwide. And this happened by the 1850s, excuse me. As part of the Industrial Revolution, the innovation of gas lighting was primarily commercial, designed to extend factory work hours. But it also served to enable outdoor social activities at night, as well as sustain its perceived role in crime prevention. By the late 1800s, electric lighting started to replace gas-fueled light, and this transformation led to the expansion of city lighting into the 20th century. In US cities and beyond, lighting, particularly electric lighting, was a symbol of the age of enlightenment and modernity, of rationality and reason and the conquest of nature. Cities in the West were brightening against a backdrop, from a Western perspective, of the proverbial darkness of colonial spaces like the African continent, believed to be primitive and irrational. As part of industrialization, lighting facilitated the intensification of labor, the growth of commerce, as well as nighttime sociality, urban design, and beautification. In his monograph on US and European urban illumination, historian of energy David Nye points out that the lighting of cities in the US in the 19th century was concentrated in commercial and prosperous areas, thereby glamorizing the cityscape with bright lights and characterizing the progress of the American city. By contrast, peripheral areas of the city, those on the outskirts, were often the least lit. These were spaces where the poor, people of color, specifically Black people, lived. And they were homes, these spaces were homes to illicit behavior such as gambling and prostitution. These were the spaces of criminal classes, quote unquote. They're left in the dark, whereas those of civility were in need of lighting and a crime deterrent. And I'll just say, as a kind of funny note, the reporting from the Times, or I think it was in Vice actually, one of the few pieces that covered omnipresence, joked about, could you imagine what would happen if these floodlights were put up on the upper west or east side of New York City? It wouldn't have happened. Nye notes that there is minimal research on these early racial and class divisions of urban public illumination, but that electricity likely reached the urban poor and of color when building codes required it to. He also points out that in the US, this intense period of illumination was conceived and occurred in the midst of the social institutionalization of deep racial hierarchies. When returning to the language of the inner city, this language is still over half a century away from the period I'm discussing. But cities were already being divided along class and racial lines, and poor communities, often of color, were being associated with vice and suspicion. It's in this constellation of forces you can observe how light distribution and function had already been enacted in racial and class ways. Much like in Europe, light also has been used in the US not only as a tool of safety, but as a tool of state policing and surveillance. A colleague here at UT, sociologist Simone Brown, researched lantern lawns in New York City as part of her scholarship on racial surveillance. Lantern laws passed in New York in the early 1700s stipulated that Black and Indigenous enslaved people had to move about this city by night with a lit candle or lantern. Echoing similar practices in medieval Europe, these laws used candlelight to supervise and surveil Black and Indigenous people's activity. White fears of Black people congregating and rebelling by night, such as slave uprisings, motivated this belief and obligations of non-white bodies in the streets to be illuminated from dusk until dawn. There were consequences for those who violated these laws. Enslaved persons found after dark without a light source were submitted to public whippings at the discretion of their masters. The use of light and darkness as tools of racialized social control continued during the Jim Crow era in the US, Sundown towns weaponized darkness to keep people of color out of white spaces by controlling the night. For those of you who are unfamiliar, sundown towns in the US were white neighborhoods, towns, or counties. Sometimes they're associated with the South, but actually they're found across the country. And these were spaces that excluded Black and sometimes Chinese, Jewish, Mexican, and Indigenous Americans under threats of violence. Similarly, the night rides of the KKK of the late 1800s and the white mobs of the early 1900s were extra-legal nighttime terror campaigns of white folks that used the cover of night to drive Black and other people, and often workers, out of town. These histories speak to how light and darkness were deployed as tools of surveillance, weaponized in service of the maintenance of white power and control. They also show how darkness, in its weaponization against Black and other people of color, rendered the night in the US a space and time of possible danger, persecution, and sometimes even death. From this history, let's come back into the current moment to think about omnipresence and its use of light. I want to highlight that this impetus for omnipresence relied on the still common logic that light reduces crime, as well as intense policing, which in the past years in the United States, we've had a lot of public uprising about and questioning the use of policing. But the data of this lighting project showed mixed outcomes, and we're talking about lighting here specifically. Violent crime increased in lit housing projects the first year by 10.1% compared to a citywide increase of 4%. So that's an increase in crime with the lighting. Another limited 2019 study claimed the lighting was a success, reducing the outdoor index crime by 4% in affected communities. In general, though, the research on light as a strategy for crime prevention or of crime prevention is inconsistent and inconclusive. Some studies suggest a positive reduction, others refute its effectiveness, and yet another study says that lighting may lead to an increase in crime. There's no overwhelming data or consensus that lighting vastly reduces crime. Yet light as an instrument of safety has continued to be called for and deployed by city leaders across the country. As one environmental journalist I read humorously wrote, street lighting is like long determinate prison sentences. More is always presumed to be better, and no politician ever lost an election calling for it. One of the risks of a lighting practice like omnipresence is not only that it may not be cost effective or fix problems, and as well we know that there are lots of consequences for the environmental impacts of lighting as well as health consequences. But with omnipresence, one of the risks is that it targets already stigmatized and marginalized people. As a short demographic overview, in 2017, over 90% of the residents where omnipresence was implemented were Black and Hispanic. In 2023, the average family's income in public housing was $25,605. $25,605. 23.6% are seniors and 24.6% are children. The average tenure of a New York City housing tenant is 25.4 years, which makes many of them really steady renters. The journalist comparison, the one that I mentioned above, or just before, was intended to bring a little humor to a heavy subject. Yet it is apt in its relating of increased lighting to incarceration and the possible effects of unjust lighting practices. In the case of New York, lighting has rendered such people and neighborhoods highly visible and exposed and in constant contact with the police. It also reinforces prevalent stereotypes about the inner city and people of color as dangerous and criminal. In 2014, the same year omnipresence was enacted, a survey from the Community Services Society in New York reported that housing, not crime, was the principal concern of New York City Housing Authority residents. Residents cited problems with infrastructure, including leaks, inadequate heating, and deficient conditions. A federal lawsuit was filed against the Housing Authority in 2018 for systemic mismanagement of our nation's largest stock of public housing. Cited were a host of environmental, health, and safety concerns, including lead paint. The Housing Authority settled, admitting to the misconduct, and was submitted to a federal monitor, who also found unsanitary conditions, including infestations and severe mold growth. While residents were being flooded with light outside and indoors, they were also contending with a host of other risks to their safety, not caused by criminals, but by the state's neglect and oversight. Living without violence, theft, and destruction, I think we could all agree are basic human desires, along with wanting a comfortable form of shelter and a means to take care of yourself and others. The survey I mentioned before is revealing. It asked residents to identify all of their concerns rather than to name only one, such as safety. Healthcare, jobs, and crime were equally prioritized at the same rate by citizens. I interpret these findings as speaking to the variety of pressures low-income people face that are also what scholars relate to as the factors that give way to violent crime. And I'm going to name these: poverty, segregation, inequality, collective efficacy, disorder, trust in institutions, job access, immigration, residential instability, such as foreclosures, vacancy rates, and evictions, land use and the built environment, such as neighborhood change and location of housing assistance. Lighting certainly has a role to play in safety, both in terms of pure mobility and in terms of crime, echoing the call of residents of the housing projects themselves. I followed the lighting practitioners at Light Justice in their position paper, co-written with Ruskin, quote, that if lighting is to be employed as an institutional tool that addresses and aids in crime deterrence, the answer must be better, not brighter lighting. Better lighting includes true engagement with those who will be illuminated and addressing what makes them feel unsafe and safe. Recognizing, let me go back here, recognizing much exists beyond the scope of light. It means interrogating the differences between lighting that is designed to surveil and control and lighting that it's designed to support and secure, especially when considering these histories targeting low-income and communities of color. Any concept and practice of light justice needs to recognize that no amount of light can make people feel safe when groups of people, often Black and brown, here in the US and in other parts of the world, have been stigmatized as violent and criminal. Light justice also attends to the reality of proverbial lighting poverty in the world that in the US might mean the ability to pay one's utility bill, while in other parts of the world, access to electricity itself. And I just want to give a plug to lightjustice.org, Light Justice, who are doing really great work and really can, I think, are taking the lead on a concept of light justice. When I shared sort of my interest in this general field of light pollution, particularly in urban spaces, with my colleague, who's also a scholar and an organizer, and who came of age in East Flatbush a neighborhood in Brooklyn, she quickly recalled hyperlit projects during the 1990s, suggesting an earlier iteration of omnipresence tactics. She remembered lights and police presence, not only targeting projects, but community organizers. As part of the same memory, she also pointed to community organizing in her neighborhood when the street lamps stopped working. Residents collectively decided to add lights outside of their homes. This action was neighbors wanting lighting to deter theft and attacks and facilitate mobility at night. Their lighting was not intended to surveil or target their communities. She emphasized that their actions were a community-generated response to safety in their neighborhood. For her, this was a significant difference. Her anecdote articulates a difference in power and decision-making in the uses of light and in the notion and creation of safety itself. And I'm gesturing to these two pictures here because I think they speak to community organizing, both out of Brooklyn, one a resident of a housing authority, and they're advocating for their rights. And then one, I think that's in Fort Greene, actually, that's celebrating local activists and heroes. I want to now briefly travel beyond New York to a couple other spaces. The first is Philadelphia, another big city not too far away from the Big Apple, where in August of 2023, the city started its own process of converting 130,000 streetlights to LEDs with dimming features after several years of planning and community feedback. The conversion of lighting is cited as a tool of crime reduction, prioritizing areas of high crime and car crashes. That said, the mayor, Kenny, also claimed the Philly Streetlight Improvement Project, which is framed as a conservation project, is also meant to reduce, as I mentioned, car crashes and work towards energy and climate goals, the city's energy and climate goals. It will be interesting to watch and see how the narrative emphasis around lighting in regards to this project might change with the implementation, especially in Philadelphia, this city of brotherly love that suffers from high crime rates, is highly racially segregated, and is also 40% Black. The other place I want to touch on lies beyond these cities and the deconstructed inner city that we've been talking about. And it comes from my work and my growing interest in sort of outreach and research here in Texas and exploring towns in Texas and what sorts of dark skies friendly policies and actions are going on. And for all of you, though, if you didn't catch it, I do live in Texas. I live in Austin. And I'm going to gesture to this picture, which is important because it's Luckenbach, Texas. I chose it. It is not reflective of what I'm going to share from the standpoint of the research. I'm not speaking about Luckenbach, but I thought it was sort of with its oak and sort of architectural style, a good evocative picture of a small town in Texas. So a dark skies advocate and educator shared with me some of their challenges they have faced around night-friendly lighting in this small Texas town. Like others in Texas, the utility company in this town supplies dark sky-friendly street and area lights for residential customers at no cost. Property owners can request compliant lighting from the utility company, which produces better illumination and saves about 30 to 50% on energy costs. In one part of town, there has been high residential participation with this dark skies friendly program. In the other side of town, residents have been reluctant to take part in the program despite the no-cost replacements and energy cost savings incentives. By comparison, one side has had about 11% reluctance, whereas on the other, there's about 75% reluctance. Although this advocate is still in the midst of learning about what impedes and what might generate compliance, they shared that the reluctant community was largely of color and surmised that the troubled racial history in the area had come to bear on this dark skies agenda. This town's predicament intrigues me, particularly as a rural community, for the ways it draws together questions of dark skies conservation with social and historical issues of race and class. In this instance, it's not the brightness of police-directed bad lighting, but in the efforts to encourage dark skies, that real divergences are revealed in the community's sentiments. I'm interested in how this community's ambivalence may be embedded in the through line of histories of oppression and racialized power. In this case, those found in Texas's history with Mexico, the Confederacy, and the process of Western expansion, which included lots of massacres of indigenous folks. There's no policing or direct weaponizing of light, but the requested lighting practices would likely benefit from a historical deep dive into the relations of power in the area, as my colleague was knowledgeable of and appreciated. Closer attention to the needs and priorities of the community might also ultimately benefit the night skies. Conversations about darkness related to the night sky need to be held in conjunction with darkness related to human activity, past and present. This is definitely a process that needs more than a few people's best efforts. To come full circle, I arrive at this work with a love of being outside and an affinity for dark skies and starry skies. And I arrive as a Black studies scholar and anthropologist whose frameworks for understanding questions of light pollution, the weaponization of light, and restoring dark skies are informed by Black ecological frames and the environmental justice lenses and movement. And I'm going to refer here to the words of J.T. Rohn and Justin Hosby, that this framework refuses to segregate toxic exposure and vulnerability to climate change from the broader political, social, and economic history of Black life and death. I will insert here, refuses to segregate lighting pollution and dark skies preservation and conservation efforts from the broader political, social, and economic history of Black life and death, as well as other marginalized, criminalized, exiled, fleeing, and invisibilized people. The girl, if we can remember from the film I showed you in Hallgren's short documentary, thinking here about the end of it, reminds us how quickly we can normalize and adapt to our environment. In her case, sort of the glow and shadow and brightness of these lights. Communities invested in restoring the nighttime environment must stay particularly astute to historical and contemporary forms of power and hierarchy, and the realities of those who contend with a range of environmental, economic, and social problems that may or may not include light pollution. Dark skies advocates also need critical analyses of environmental and social struggles in order to develop the alliances and solidarities that can advance the scope of this very worthy work. The cautionary is that without this kind of knowledge and approach, the work risks repeating histories of domination rather than building relationships and coalitions. The beauty of the dark skies is that we all share them. Their metaphor is one of our interconnectedness. The range of cosmologies from across the world speak to this ancient and ongoing relationship, as does Dark Sky International's work. The history of light pollution, by contrast, tells the story of a distancing of people from the sky, from the natural world, and from each other. Light justice responds to the history of inequities in lighting and its misuses with a summons to address this past through a more socially and environmentally sound application of good lighting. And I think in turn, this good lighting can play a role in community building. To this, I'd like to join a concept of just darkness, just as in justice, just darkness, where the pursuit of a preservation of darkness stays awake and aware and active in other environmental and social issues and struggles, that it critically and creatively looks for connections in the most illuminated spaces as well as in the darkest places, while staying curious and also courageously willing to venture into the shadows. And I'll put this up in conclusion, just so you have another reference to who I am and my contact information. Should there be additional questions that we don't get to, or there's anything in what I shared that you're interested in, I'm happy to be in touch. So thank you very much for your attention today.
And thank you, Celeste. That is incredible information, a lot of great insight into the history, at least in the United States, on how light has been used as an oppressive, an oppressive means to, the underserved, the quote unquote undeserving, and we can see how it still goes on today. And in fact, we have a question from Todd Burlett in Minnesota. He asks if you could say a few words about how the legacy of redlining continues to impact the light exposure of marginalized communities.
Yeah, it's not an area that I've looked into tons, so I'd say that, but I think in general, there's research that supports the idea that where Black and particularly brown Latinx communities are, that there's a lot of light pollution. So that light pollution is unevenly distributed across race. And I would connect that to, I think there's ample research out there and even common knowledge that some ways those histories of segregation made it such that there's overexposure to light or factory work and whatnot, factories, I should say, that are in places, poor spaces that often coincide or are Black and brown places as well. And so there's a disproportionate burden of light pollution in those communities, and redlining being a practice basically of segregation, of making it hard for people of color to buy in historically or I should say in white neighborhoods, to put it straightforwardly. So that history of segregation, and there's research now that's substantiating that, I should say, that these geographic patterns of segregation and the brunt that they do carry, I should say, folks of color do carry the brunt of light pollution. And thanks for the question. I hope that addresses it.
Yeah. Well, yes, thank you for your question, Todd. I have a question. So you yourself as a researcher into these issues, what do you think are the gaps in the research related to light justice right now? I mean, I feel like it's a very it's a budding area of research, perhaps. So maybe there's a lot of gaps, but what do you see are kind of the immediate ones that we ought to look to fill?
Yeah, I've put some thought into, it might have been the reverse, or how to hold these conversations together. I think one thing I've noticed, and I'm speaking not from a practitioner standpoint, but from a researcher, and I'm relatively new to this, and I would say that makes a difference because I'm not on the ground out doing the advocacy work that many of you all are doing, and would have a very kind of immediate sense of this. But one thing I've noticed in the research is that their kind of light is held separately from darkness. So there's a call by environmental historians primarily that these need to be always held in their multiplicity and in conversation with each other. It's almost implicit, or it seems somewhat implicit, that when we talk about light, we're thinking about darkness and vice versa. But the research doesn't tend to do that. And I'm thinking in one particular, there's an article that was written by an environmental historian, Sarah Pritchard, who's at Cornell, who talked about the famous, blue globe imagery that was used to talk about, that came out, I think in 2012, the reproduction of it to show the contrast of basically where there's light and where there's not, that highlighted those. Some of you might be familiar with that. And she used that imagery as a way of talking about how it focuses on, almost romanticizes darkness, while also showing kind of where the illumination is, almost, and this is produced by NASA, and is a kind of call to that we need, this within light of preserving darkness and sort of our love and romantic idea of the night skies. Her critique was certainly not that we shouldn't be doing that, but that the image itself could also highlight where there is an electricity, right? And that we need to grapple with the historical legacies where folks still don't have access to electricity. And so to think about these things together, I think that's sort of the broader conceptual work, is we need to both think about how do we attend to these inequities in the world without losing sight, in the case of very much the preservation or conservation of the night sky. That's our end goal and our work. Then how do we grapple with all of these histories and inequities? I think a global perspective needs to always be in the framework when doing this work, even at a very a very local level.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a great segue into kind of the next question we wanted to ask. So, yeah, you and your colleagues, you focus on the research, and then I know, part of that is making the research accessible and not just, having the ability to read it, but to understand it and then, present it in our community. So, how do you recommend, we as advocates take the information that you find, the data that you gather and conclude on, and how do we make that accessible to our community leaders, especially for those of us who aren't in the kind of underserved or oppressed, demographics like me. I'm a 32-year-old white man in Colorado. So how do I become a good ally in this way?
Yeah, I think one of the takeaways from the environmental justice movement, and this is speaking more to the part of allyship, and I can address the other afterwards, but is looking for where there are conversations. And I also think there's a little creativity here about where there might be sort of unsuspecting conversations with of an alliance between sort of light justice issues or lighting pollution issues and other environmental concerns. I think the way in is through through our shared reality, but our shared concern with human welfare and environmental welfare. So looking for where the conversation can broaden so that there are, I'm thinking I'm in Austin, I'm not too far away from Cancer Alley. I can't imagine in Louisiana that there are not massive lighting pollution concerns as well. And there's a lot of wonderful organizing being done by historically Black communities there, for example, that have not only bore the brunt of enslavement, these histories of enslavement and exploitation in the area, but also these plants and whatnot, the environmental tolls of that. And so it's a complex issue that folks are organizing around. I would love to see those types of synergies and conversations taking place. So that's one thing. As far as the research piece, I have a little bit of a different job as an anthropologist. I'm more on the qualitative side, and so I myself have to do work to grapple with the numbers, the statistics, and I think so. I don't know what to tell you about that, except for those folks. I've seen folks who would break down light pollution, who doing that kind of mapping, break things down, and I think that's excellent. We need that kind of data. But then I would throw this question back to all of you who are doing the direct advocacy and outreach, which is like, what lands? I'm still trying to figure out or answer that question myself in presenting this work. So I need to learn from you all too, when you're engaging with people who just love the outdoors and the dark. The information that I bring isn't always easy for my particular interest, but I do think it is necessary and doesn't have to be scary, particularly because what the work is about has such a broader kind of calling. And I think that I actually think I'm interested in knowing what a lot of these folks in urban environments relationships with the sky are, you know, that's an area of research I'm interested in, not simply assuming they don't have one or it's already been damaged by light pollution.
Yeah.
So a couple ideas.
All right. Well, hey, we appreciate those ideas, Celeste, and everything, all the thoughts you've shared with us today. Truly a wonderful work you're doing. It's enlightening as it is. And, you know, this is one of those issues, or this aspect of this issue that we really want to talk more about, because it's not just about our love of the sky or the wilderness, it's about our love of each other. And, you know, you as an anthropologist understand. So, how we commune and live together and live with our world is always at the utmost importance. So thank you again, Celeste, for joining us today. Everyone who has asked, and just to reiterate, yes, this meeting is recorded. We will post it on our YouTube page, and we will send an email with the link to that here within the next day or two. So keep an eye out for it. If you have any questions for Celeste, she put her email address and contact information there on her last slide. So if you didn't catch that, go back to the recording and look for that at the end. In the meantime, please, everybody, have a wonderful rest of your day, your afternoon, your night. Celeste, thank you so much again for joining us, and we look forward to hearing you sometime in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.